The courtroom air was thick with the suffocating arrogance of Richard Sterling. He sat back in his custom Zegna suit, a mocking smirk playing on his lips as his high-priced attorney demanded his wife be left with absolutely nothing. Clara sat quietly across the aisle, staring at the polished mahogany table. She had been financially gutted, socially destroyed, and publicly humiliated over the last 8 months. But as the judge raised his gavel to finalize her utter ruin, Clara's junior attorney submitted one final, seemingly insignificant piece of paper, an unredacted copy of her original birth certificate. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the single line of text. The color instantly drained from his face. The gavel froze midair. The entire courtroom went dead silent, because Clara wasn't just Clara Sterling, and the man trying to destroy her was about to realize he had just sued his own landlord, his bank, and his ultimate boss. The rain was coming down in sheets on the Tuesday afternoon. Clara's reality shattered. She was 34 years old, driving her sensible Volvo SUV up the winding, meticulously manicured driveway of the $6 million Connecticut estate she shared with her husband, Richard. For 10 years, Clara had been the perfect corporate wife. She had smiled at the dreadful cocktail parties, organized the charity galas, and quietly supported Richard as he climbed the ruthless ladder to become the CEO of Vanguard Logistics, a premier supply chain conglomerate. Clara had always preferred the background. She dressed simply, drove a safe car, and never flaunted wealth. Richard, on the other hand, was a man who needed the world to know he had arrived. He wore his success like a weapon, wielding it to intimidate everyone from valet drivers to board members. Clara had noticed his growing distance over the past year, the late nights at the office, the sudden, unexplained weekend, golf retreats to Miami, the password changes on his phone, but she had rationalized it as the stress of his new executive position. When Clara pulled into the garage, Richard's slate-gray Porsche Panamera was already there. That was the first anomaly. Richard never came home before 7. Clara walked through the mudroom and froze. Sitting in the center of their cavernous, marble-floored foyer were 3 designer suitcases. Her suitcases. "Richard?" Clara called out, her voice echoing slightly. He walked out of his study, holding a crystal glass of Macallan scotch. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sad. He looked utterly, chillingly bored. "I've packed the essentials," Richard said, taking a slow sip. His tone was casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "The rest of your things will be sent to a storage unit. I've already arranged for a moving company." Clara dropped her keys. They clattered loudly against the floor. "Richard, what are you talking about? Are we going somewhere?" "No, Clara. You are going somewhere. I am staying right here." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and tossed a thick manila envelope onto the console table. "I filed for divorce this morning. The papers have been officially served. I want you out of this house in the next 10 minutes. The words felt like a physical blow to her chest. "Divorce? Richard, what is happening? 10 years? You're just throwing me out on a Tuesday afternoon?" "I've outgrown you, Clara," he said, stepping closer. The cruelty in his eyes was naked now. "I'm running a billion-dollar company, and you're still playing house, acting like a little librarian. I need a partner who reflects my status. You don't. You never did." Before Clara could process the sheer callousness of his words, the heavy oak front door opened. In walked a woman who couldn't have been older than 25. She was stunning in a predatory sort of way, tall, dressed in a sleek Alexander McQueen trench coat, holding a small Birkin bag. Clara recognized her immediately. It was Chloe Bennett, Richard's newly hired VP of Public Relations. Chloe didn't even look at Clara. She walked straight past her, wrapping an arm around Richard's waist and kissing his cheek. "Is she leaving, babe? The decorators are coming at 4, and I don't want her in the way." Clara felt the room spin. The humiliation washed over her like ice water. "You're moving her in? Today? We've been together for 2 years, Clara," Richard smirked, finishing his drink. "It's time she got the house she deserves. Now, please, leave before I have security escort you off the property." Trembling, Clara grabbed the envelope, took her suitcases, and walked out into the pouring rain. She got into her Volvo, her hands shaking so violently she could barely start the ignition. She pulled out of the gates, tears blinding her vision. She drove down the highway toward a nearby Marriott, intending to check in and figure out a plan. When she handed her platinum credit card to the hotel concierge, the machine beeped. Declined. Clara frowned, handing over her debit card tied to their joint account at First National Bank of Delaware. Declined. Panic rising, Clara pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. Where there was supposed to be over $2 million in liquid savings, the screen displayed a bright red 0. Richard hadn't just thrown her out. He had meticulously, flawlessly stripped her of every single dime she had to her name. Over the next 3 weeks, Clara learned just how monstrous the man she had loved truly was. Unable to access her own money, Clara was forced to pawn her wedding ring. A painful, degrading experience at a dingy shop in Bridgeport just to afford a month-to-month lease in a rundown, one-bedroom apartment over a noisy laundromat. The walls were paper-thin, the heat barely worked, and the smell of bleach seeped through the floorboards. She needed a lawyer, but the moment the prestigious firms ran a background check on the divorce filings, they refused to take her case. Richard had hired Arthur Pendleton, a senior partner at Pendleton, Hayes, and Carmichael. Pendleton was a shark in bespoke Italian leather, a man notorious in the state for employing scorched earth tactics that left ex-wives legally bankrupted and psychologically broken. He had preemptively filed injunctions, tying up every marital asset, claiming Clara had mismanaged funds and was a flight risk. Desperate, Clara finally found representation in Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a 28-year-old public defender who had recently opened her own small family law practice in a dilapidated strip mall. She was incredibly smart, but severely underfunded and outgunned. "Clara, I'm going to be straight with you," Sarah said during their second meeting, her desk covered in towering stacks of financial documents. "Richard has been planning this for years. This wasn't a sudden decision. He systematically drained the joint accounts over the last 36 months. He didn't just move the money, he laundered it." "Laundered it?" Clara asked, wrapping her thin coat tighter around herself. "How is that even legal?" "It's not, but proving it is nearly impossible without an army of forensic accountants," Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "He funneled the money under the guise of consulting fees and investment losses into a web of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. The primary holding company is called Triton Holdings. On paper, Richard's net worth right now is negative. He's claiming the $6 million house belongs to the corporation, his cars are leased, and his salary is currently being restructured. He makes $4 million a year," Clara said, her voice shaking with quiet rage. "And he left me with $20 in my checking account." "It gets worse," Sarah said gently, sliding a legal notice across the desk. "Pendleton just filed a motion for spousal support. From you." Clara stared at the document, feeling a fresh wave of nausea. "He wants me to pay him?" "It's a power play," Sarah explained. "He knows you have nothing, but by filing this, he forces us into court to defend it, draining whatever meager resources we have left. Furthermore, he's citing a clause in the prenup you signed 10 years ago, the one you told me you didn't even have a lawyer read." Clara remembered that day. She had trusted him blindly. He told her it was just a standard formality for the board of directors. The social fallout was just as devastating. Clara's phone stopped ringing. The women she had hosted at luncheons, the wives of Richard's colleagues who had called her their closest confidant, completely ghosted her. When she tried to attend Sunday service at her longtime church, the pastor's wife pulled her aside and quietly suggested that her presence was causing a disruption, given the scandalous rumors Richard had spread about her mental health. Richard and Chloe, meanwhile, were everywhere. They were photographed on the red carpet at the Met Gala. They were featured in a glossy spread in Connecticut Home and Garden, showing off the newly redecorated estate. Chloe was wearing Clara's grandmother's vintage diamond necklace in the photos. The humiliation peaked at the preliminary hearings. Clara sat in the drafty courthouse, wearing a thrift store blazer, while Richard and Chloe sat across the aisle looking like royalty. Richard didn't even look at her. Arthur Pendleton argued aggressively, painting Clara as a lazy, erratic woman who had contributed nothing to the marriage and was now trying to steal a brilliant man's hard-earned corporate assets. The judge, clearly swayed by Pendleton's aggressive confidence in Richard's fabricated financial ruin, ruled temporarily in Richard's favor. Clara was denied any emergency alimony and ordered to pay $5,000 in Richard's legal fees within 30 days, or face contempt of court. That night, Clara sat in the dark of her freezing apartment, listening to the washing machines rumble on the floor below. She was entirely alone, She was facing jail time for a debt she couldn't pay. She was broken. She looked at her cheap prepaid cell phone, resting on the cracked Formica counter. For 10 years, Clara had kept a promise to herself. She had wanted a normal life. She had wanted a man who loved her for her, not for her bloodline. She had completely legally buried her past, changing her name and cutting off access to a world of unimaginable power just so she could be Clara. She had sworn she would never go back. But as she looked at a magazine clipping of Richard and Chloe smirking in her house, something inside Clara finally snapped. The sadness evaporated. The humiliation burned away, leaving nothing but cold, absolute fury. She picked up the phone, dialed a secure international number she hadn't called in a decade, and waited for the click. "Geneva office, state your authorization," a crisp voice answered. Clara took a deep breath. "This is Clara Kensington Sinclair. Connect me to the chairman of the trust. Tell him his daughter's finally coming home." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, a heavy, expensive silence that stretched across the Atlantic. For 10 years, Clara had kept that number locked away in the deepest recesses of her memory. It was a direct line to the private banking sector of Geneva, circumventing every receptionist and automated system, routing straight to the inner sanctum of the Kensington Sinclair family office. Clara. The voice that finally broke the silence was entirely devoid of warmth, yet it carried the undeniable, crushing weight of generational authority. It was her father, William Kensington Sinclair. A man who did not merely possess wealth, he dictated global markets. He was a phantom in the financial world, a man whose name never appeared on Forbes lists because the families who owned the lists worked for him. "Hello, father," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her fingers gripped the edge of the cracked Formica counter until her knuckles turned white. 10 years, William said, his clipped British accent slicing through the static. "A decade of absolute silence because you wish to play the commoner. You wish to marry a mid-level corporate climber with a vulgar taste for leased sports cars and cheap suits. I told you, Clara, when you walked out of the London estate, that the world outside our walls was built on greed. Have you finally discovered the truth of my words?" "Yes," Clara whispered, the freezing air of her apartment suddenly feeling sharp against her skin. "I was a fool. And he has taken everything." "He has taken nothing but your patience," William corrected coldly. "A Sinclair cannot be robbed by a peasant. It is a mathematical impossibility." "Where are you?" "Bridgeport. In an apartment above a laundromat." The admission tasted like ash. William did not sigh. He did not express pity. Pity was an emotion the Kensington Sinclairs found entirely useless. "Remain exactly where you are. Do not speak to anyone. Do not sign anything. The machinery is already moving." The line went dead. Clara sat on the edge of her lumpy, thrift store mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper. For the first time in nearly a year, she didn't cry. The despair that had been suffocating her was rapidly being replaced by something cold, metallic, and incredibly precise. Less than 3 hours later, the rhythmic thumping of the washing machines downstairs was drowned out by the low, predatory purr of a massive engine. Clara looked out the frosted, grime-covered window. Parked illegally on the cracked pavement was an obsidian black Maybach Pullman, flanked by 2 black Range Rovers. The vehicles were imposing, spotless, and utterly alien in the rundown neighborhood. A man stepped out of the Maybach. He was tall, perfectly tailored in a charcoal bespoke suit, holding an umbrella with a silver handle. He didn't knock on the apartment building's main door. He simply bypassed the broken lock and walked upstairs. When Clara opened her door, he offered a slight, formal bow. "Miss Kensington Sinclair. I am Thomas Croft. Your father sent me." Croft wasn't a chauffeur. He was the head of Sinclair Global Security, a man who coordinated extractions from hostile foreign territories and managed the family's vast network of corporate intelligence. "You're taking me back to London?" Clara asked, hesitant. "No, ma'am," Croft replied, stepping into the cramped room and ignoring the overwhelming scent of bleach. "Your father's instructions were quite clear. You are not to retreat. We are bringing London to you. If it pleases you, a suite has been prepared at the Four Seasons in New York. However, regarding your immediate problem," Croft reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek, titanium tablet. He tapped the screen and handed it to Clara. "We have spent the last 2 hours running a full diagnostic on Richard Sterling," Croft said, his tone entirely clinical. "He believes he is quite clever. He has routed approximately $4.2 million into a holding company in the Cayman Islands known as Triton Holdings. He used a series of nested shell corporations in Delaware and the British Virgin Islands to obscure the paper trail." Clara stared at the screen, which displayed a dizzying flowchart of Richard's financial betrayals. "My lawyer, Sarah, said it would take an army of forensic accountants years to prove this in court." Croft allowed a microscopic smile to touch his lips. "Your lawyer is accustomed to playing by the rules of the American judicial system, Miss Sinclair. We own the board the game is played upon. Richard Sterling's offshore accounts are managed by Banque de l'Avenir. What Mr. Sterling, in his infinite arrogance, failed to research is the parent company of that bank." Clara's eyes widened as she traced the line on the flowchart up to the very top. "The Kensington Sinclair Trust," Clara breathed. "Precisely," Croft nodded. "Mr. Sterling has been hiding his stolen money in your family's vault. We have complete, unredacted access to every wire transfer, every IP address he used to authorize the movements, and every forged invoice he created. We have his financial soul in a digital jar." "So we freeze it?" Clara asked, a spark of pure adrenaline surging through her veins. "We take it to the judge?" "Not yet," Croft advised, gently taking the tablet back. "If you reveal this now, he will claim a misunderstanding. He will settle. Your father does not wish for Mr. Sterling to merely settle. He wishes for an example to be made. We are going to let Mr. Sterling build his own gallows, and we are going to let him pull the lever himself." Clara looked around the miserable, freezing apartment one last time. She left her cheap coat on the chair. She left the prepaid phone on the counter. She walked out the door and descended the stairs, stepping into the back of the Maybach. As the heavy door closed with a vault-like thud, Clara Sterling died, and Clara Kensington Sinclair was resurrected. The pacing of the next month was agonizingly deliberate. While Clara was quietly relocated to a sprawling, private penthouse overlooking Central Park, surrounded by a phalanx of legal scholars, private investigators, and financial analysts flown in from Zurich, she maintained a careful illusion of utter defeat. She kept Sarah Jenkins as her primary attorney on record. When Sarah was summoned to the penthouse for their first meeting under the new paradigm, the young public defender nearly dropped her briefcase. She had expected to find Clara in a tearful panic. Instead, she found her client sitting at the head of a massive, mahogany dining table, reviewing encrypted financial dossiers alongside Thomas Croft and 2 senior partners from the most feared corporate litigation firm in Manhattan. "Clara," Sarah stammered, looking at the panoramic view of the New York skyline, then back at the titanium-cased laptops on the table. "What is all this?" "Sarah, please sit down," Clara said warmly, gesturing to a plush leather chair. She was dressed in a simple but flawlessly cut cream cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. The nervous, defeated woman was gone. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about my background. That is no longer the case. I want you to meet my advisory team." Over the next 4 hours, Croft laid out the meticulous, devastating reality of Richard's crimes. Sarah sat in stunned silence as she was handed irrefutable proof of wire fraud, perjury, and grand larceny. This is a nuclear bomb," Sarah whispered, staring at a printout of Richard's Cayman Island account statements. "If I take this to the judge right now, Arthur Pendleton will be disbarred for submitting fraudulent financial affidavits, and Richard will be arrested. Which is exactly why we are not taking it to the judge right now," Clara stated, her voice calm, devoid of any vindictive heat, which made it all the more terrifying. "Richard is a narcissist. If we corner him now, he'll panic and try to cut a deal. He'll play the victim, claiming bad financial advice. I want him under oath. I want him on the record, confidently and arrogantly lying to the court. I want him to commit perjury so severe that no plea deal in the world can save him from a federal penitentiary." Sarah swallowed hard, looking at Clara with a newfound mixture of awe and fear. "You want to set a trap. I want to orchestrate an execution," Clara corrected softly. "Tomorrow is the asset deposition. You are going to go in there and play the overwhelmed, underfunded lawyer. You are going to ask him specifically about Triton Holdings. Let him lie. Let Pendleton gloat. Document every single lie." The next morning, the deposition took place in the lavish, glass-walled conference room of Arthur Pendleton's firm. The table was polished walnut. The coffee was artisanal. Richard sat at the head of the table, wearing a custom navy Brioni suit, his Rolex gleaming under the recessed lighting. He looked incredibly bored. Beside him sat Chloe, playing with her phone, completely unapologetic about her presence at a legal proceeding regarding his marriage. Pendleton sat across from Sarah, leaning back in his chair with a predatory smirk. Sarah Jenkins looked the part of the struggling public defender perfectly. She had purposely rumpled her blazer and disorganized her legal pads. Clara sat beside her, silent, her hands folded in her lap, wearing a modest, unremarkable dress. "Let's get this over with, Miss Jenkins." Pendleton sighed dramatically, checking his watch. "My client has a company to run. We've submitted the financial affidavits, Mr. Sterling's net worth is thoroughly documented. He has 0 liquid assets, significant debts to Vanguard Logistics, and the estate is owned by a corporate entity. I just have a few clarifications for the record," Sarah said, her voice intentionally wavering slightly. She clicked her pen. "Mr. Sterling, you are under oath. Do you have any offshore accounts, specifically in the Cayman Islands?" Richard offered a patronizing chuckle. "Miss Jenkins, do I look like a Bond villain? No. All my accounts are domestic and, sadly, quite empty, thanks to the economic downturn." "For the record," Sarah pressed, looking at her notes, "have you ever heard of an entity named Triton Holdings?" Pendleton rolled his eyes. Asked and answered in the discovery phase, "Counsel, my client has no association with any such entity. This is a fishing expedition." "I'll answer it, Arthur," Richard interrupted, leaning forward and looking directly at Clara with a gaze of pure contempt. "Clara, I know you're desperate. I know you're trying to find some hidden pot of gold to maintain the lifestyle you contributed absolutely nothing to. But it doesn't exist. I have no knowledge of Triton Holdings. I have no hidden funds. I am practically bankrupt. If you keep dragging this out, I will ensure you pay every cent of my legal fees for the rest of your natural life." Clara didn't flinch. She simply looked back at him, her expression an unreadable mask. "Is that your final answer on the record, Richard?" "It is the absolute, legal truth," Richard sneered. Sarah meticulously wrote it down. "And the $4 million missing from your joint First National accounts over the last 3 years? Bad investments in the tech sector," Richard lied smoothly without missing a beat. "Market fluctuations. Tragic, really." Pendleton clapped his hands together. "Are we quite finished? We will see you in court next Tuesday for the final judgment on asset division and spousal support. I suggest you bring a checkbook, Clara." As Richard stood up, buttoning his jacket, Chloe leaned over and whispered loudly enough for the room to hear. "I told you she was delusional. Babe, let's go look at that boat in Montauk." They walked out, the very picture of untouchable, arrogant success. Once the heavy glass doors closed, Sarah let out a long, shaky breath and looked over at Clara. "He just lied under oath 32 times, Sarah whispered. "He committed perjury on the record, with a court stenographer present." Clara stood up slowly, smoothing the skirt of her modest dress. The trap had been set, the bait taken, and the steel jaws were perfectly positioned. "Yes, he did," Clara said quietly. "Call Thomas Croft. Tell him it's time to inform the judge who I really am." The days leading up to the final court date were not filled with frantic scrambling, but with the terrifying, hushed efficiency of a global empire mobilizing for war. In the sprawling penthouse high above Central Park, Clara did not sleep much. She spent her nights standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the headlights carve through the Manhattan rain, a cup of untouched Darjeeling tea cooling in her hands. For 10 years, she had actively suppressed the predatory instincts bred into her by the Kensington Sinclair bloodline. She had wanted to believe in a world where love was a shield and kindness was a currency. Richard had violently cured her of that delusion. Now, as she reviewed the devastating dossiers Thomas Croft laid on the mahogany table each morning, she felt a profound, icy calm settling into her bones. She was no longer a victim. She was an architect. Croft's methods were agonizingly thorough. He did not simply want to expose Richard's hidden wealth. He wanted to systematically dismantle the foundation of Richard's reality before the man even stepped foot in the courtroom. "Mr. Sterling's entire identity is tethered to his position at Vanguard Logistics," Croft explained one afternoon, his voice an unhurried, measured baritone as he tapped a silver pen against a leather-bound folio. "He uses the company's infrastructure to mask his personal expenditures, and he leverages their corporate credit to maintain his lifestyle. He believes he is untouchable because he is the CEO. Clara traced the rim of her teacup. And who, exactly, owns the debt of Vanguard Logistics? Croft allowed a rare, grim shadow of a smile. That is the poetry of the situation, Miss Sinclair. Vanguard Logistics is heavily leveraged. They recently required a massive influx of capital to expand their shipping fleet into the Mediterranean. Their primary lender is a consortium based in Geneva. A consortium that your father, William, chairs. So, my father technically owns Richard's company, Clara murmured, the pieces snapping together with terrifying precision. In essence, yes, Croft nodded, and per the covenants of those corporate loans, any executive officer found to be engaged in financial fraud, moral turpitude, or severe legal negligence can be immediately terminated without severance, and their stock options clawed back to satisfy the debt. Clara absorbed this. The destruction of Richard Sterling was not going to be a simple divorce settlement. It was going to be a corporate execution. To ensure the trap was inescapable, Croft initiated a silent siege on Richard's immediate resources. It started with microscopic, maddening inconveniences. 3 days before the trial, Richard and Chloe were dining at Le Bernardin in Midtown. When Richard casually tossed his black titanium American Express onto the silver tray to cover the $1,200 bill, the waiter returned a few minutes later, intensely apologetic. "I am so sorry, Mr. Sterling, but the card has been declined." A security hold, perhaps? Richard had flushed a violent, ugly shade of red, cursing the waiter for his incompetence, and was forced to use a corporate expense card to cover the meal. He assumed it was a bank error. He had no idea that a single phone call from a Sinclair holding company in London had flagged his offshore asset transfers as potential international money laundering, instantly freezing his shadow accounts, pending a federal compliance review. The next day, the lease on Richard's slate-gray Porsche Panamera was quietly flagged for non-payment. The dealership, suddenly receiving a highly irregular audit notice from their own parent financing company, another distant tentacle of the Sinclair reach, was ordered to prepare for repossession. Richard felt none of the noose tightening around his neck. He was too insulated by his own arrogance. He spent the weekend in the Hamptons with Chloe, drinking vintage champagne on a rented yacht, completely blind to the fact that the water he was floating on was already boiling. Back in the penthouse, Sarah Jenkins was undergoing a transformation of her own. The young public defender, who had previously been drowning in Pendleton's aggressive paperwork, was now armed with the most devastating legal arsenal imaginable. She spent hours rehearsing with Clara's elite corporate litigators, learning how to wield the massive weight of the evidence with surgical precision. "You don't just present the documents, Sarah," instructed Harrison Caldwell, a silver-haired shark of a litigator flown in from Zurich to act as shadow counsel. "You let Pendleton build his client a pedestal of lies. You let him speak to the public record, and only when he has proudly stated, unequivocally, that his client is a ruined, penniless man, do you pull the pin on the grenade." On the eve of the trial, Clara sat alone in the dark, looking at the single piece of paper that would end it all. It wasn't a bank statement or a wire transfer log. It was a certified, unredacted birth certificate from the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. It listed her mother, the late Lady Eleanor Sinclair, and her father, William Kensington Sinclair. She folded it carefully, placed it in her leather portfolio, and closed the clasp. The mourning period for her marriage was over. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. The morning of the final judgment was bitterly cold, the sky over Connecticut a bruised, heavy gray. The courthouse smelled of stale coffee, lemon polish, and quiet desperation. Clara arrived precisely on time. She wore a tailored, midnight blue Dior suit that whispered of old money, her posture impeccable, her expression utterly unreadable. Beside her walked Sarah Jenkins, no longer the rumpled, overwhelmed rookie. Sarah wore a sharp charcoal blazer, carrying a single, slim briefcase. They took their seats at the plaintiff's table in the cavernous, wood-paneled courtroom. A moment later, the heavy double doors swung open, and Richard Sterling made his entrance. He was the very picture of arrogant triumph, flanked by Arthur Pendleton and an assistant carrying 3 heavy boxes of supposed financial discovery. Richard wore his custom Zegna suit, shooting his cuffs as he sat down. Chloe slipped into the gallery directly behind him, crossing her legs and loudly snapping a piece of gum, looking at Clara with a mixture of pity and intense boredom. "Enjoying your last day of free legal counsel, Clara?" Richard leaned across the aisle, his voice a mocking hiss. "I hear the homeless shelters in Bridgeport are lovely this time of year." Clara did not turn her head. She did not blink. She merely stared straight ahead at the judge's bench. "All rise," the bailiff barked. The Honorable David Rosenthal, a no-nonsense judge with a reputation for a quick temper and a deep disdain for frivolous litigation, took his seat. He adjusted his heavy glasses and looked down at the docket, clearly already exhausted by the case. "Sterling versus Sterling," Judge Rosenthal sighed, flipping open the file. "Asset division, finalization of divorce, and a motion for spousal support filed by the respondent, Mr. Sterling." "Mr. Pendleton, you have the floor. Let's make this efficient." Arthur Pendleton stood up, buttoning his jacket with a theatrical flourish. He paced slowly in front of the bench, his voice booming with practiced indignation. "Your Honor, we are here today to put an end to a parasitic attachment," Pendleton began, gesturing dismissively toward Clara. "For 10 years, my client, Richard Sterling, has broken his back building a corporate empire. He has suffered the intense pressures of executive leadership, only to come home to a woman who contributed absolutely nothing to the marital estate. And now, due to a severe economic downturn and tragic market fluctuations, my client finds himself financially ruined." Pendleton paused for dramatic effect, placing a hand on his chest. "He has no liquid assets. His home is owned by a corporate entity to shield him from bankruptcy. He is heavily in debt. Yet, the plaintiff, Clara Sterling, continues to harass him, demanding money that simply does not exist. We are asking the court to finalize this divorce, deny her any alimony, and enforce the prenuptial agreement, which stipulates she assumes responsibility for my client's legal fees, totaling $140,000. She has drained him of his spirit, Your Honor. We ask that she not be allowed to drain him of his future." Richard looked down, pinching the bridge of his nose in a masterful display of manufactured exhaustion. In the gallery, Chloe nodded sympathetically. Judge Rosenthal looked over his glasses at Clara's table. "Miss Jenkins, your client has failed to produce any evidence contradicting Mr. Pendleton's financial affidavits. Are you prepared to accept the ruling, or do you have something substantive to add before I sign these orders?" Sarah Jenkins stood up. She did not rush. She picked up a single manila folder from her desk. "Your Honor, the plaintiff does have a brief submission for the record," Sarah said, her voice ringing out clear and steady, devoid of the nervous tremor that had characterized her earlier appearances. "Before the court rules on Mr. Sterling's profound financial destitution, we felt it necessary to correct a minor clerical error regarding the plaintiff's legal identity." Pendleton scoffed loudly. "A clerical error? Your Honor, this is a stalling tactic." "I will allow it, Miss Jenkins." "Make it quick," Judge Rosenthal said, leaning back. Sarah approached the bench and handed the bailiff a single sheet of paper. The bailiff passed it up to the judge. "Your Honor, my client's legal name is not Clara Sterling," Sarah stated, her voice echoing in the silent room. "Nor was she born Clara Evans, as her marriage license states. For privacy and security reasons dating back over a decade, my client has operated under a legally sanctioned alias." Judge Rosenthal picked up the paper. It was the unredacted birth certificate. He read the first line, he read the second line. The color instantly drained from his face. The heavy wooden gavel he had been absent-mindedly rolling in his hand froze midway across the desk. He looked up, his eyes wide, staring at the woman sitting quietly at the plaintiff's table. Is this document authenticated, counsel?" Judge Rosenthal asked, his voice suddenly lacking any trace of its previous annoyance. It was replaced by a profound, cautious reverence. "It is fully authenticated by the British Consulate and the United States Department of State, Your Honor," Sarah replied smoothly. Pendleton slammed his hand on his desk. "Objection. What is the meaning of this? Who cares what her maiden name is? It has no bearing on my client's bankruptcy." "It has every bearing, Mr. Pendleton," Judge Rosenthal snapped, his voice sharp like a cracking whip. He looked directly at Richard. "Because your client has just sworn under penalty of perjury that he is destitute, while simultaneously transferring $4.2 million into an offshore holding company." Richard's head snapped up. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent twitch in his jaw. "What?" he breathed. Sarah turned to face the courtroom, opening her slim briefcase. "Your Honor, I am submitting Exhibit A, complete, unredacted wire transfer logs, IP login histories, and offshore bank statements for an entity known as Triton Holdings, based in the Cayman Islands." Mr. Sterling swore under oath in deposition last week that he had no knowledge of this company. However, these documents prove he is the sole beneficial owner. "This is fabricated garbage," Pendleton roared, panic finally bleeding into his pristine facade. "Those accounts are protected by international privacy laws. There is no way a public defender accessed Cayman Island banking records. I demand to know how this evidence was obtained." Sarah offered a cold, predatory smile that belonged entirely to Clara. "We didn't need to hack the bank, Mr. Pendleton," Sarah said softly, yet the words carried to every corner of the room. "We simply asked the bank's owner." Sarah turned and gestured gracefully toward Clara. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "May I formally introduce my client to the record, Clara Victoria Kensington Sinclair, sole heir to the Kensington Sinclair Trust, the parent organization of Banque de l'Avenir, the very bank where Mr. Sterling has been hiding his stolen funds." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. Richard sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, the blood draining from his face until he looked like a wax corpse. He looked at Clara. For the first time in 10 years, he truly looked at her. He didn't see the quiet, submissive librarian he had thrown out in the rain. He saw a woman whose bloodline had toppled governments. He had not just sued his wife. He had sued his bank. And as the realization of his federal wire fraud, committed directly against one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth, crashed down upon him, Richard Sterling realized he was not going to lose his house. He was going to lose his freedom. The silence in the courtroom was not merely the absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating physical weight that pressed down on Richard Sterling's chest. For a full 60 seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique mahogany clock mounted above the judge's bench, counting down the final seconds of a narcissist's fabricated reality. Judge David Rosenthal slowly lowered the unredacted birth certificate and the offshore banking dossiers. He took off his reading glasses, placing them deliberately on the polished wood of his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its previous judicial weariness, replaced by a cold, quiet fury that commanded absolute terror. "Mr. Pendleton?" Judge Rosenthal began, his eyes locking onto Richard's attorney. "As an officer of this court, you have just submitted financial affidavits, sworn under penalty of perjury, claiming your client is utterly destitute. Yet, I am looking at certified, unassailable documentation from Banque de l'Avenir, proving your client is the sole beneficiary of an offshore holding company containing over $4 million. Money that, according to these wire transfer logs, was systematically siphoned from marital accounts over the last 36 months. Arthur Pendleton, a man who had built a lucrative career on aggressive bluster and intimidation, physically recoiled. The pristine tailoring of his suit suddenly seemed to swallow him. He looked at the documents Sarah Jenkins had placed before him, his eyes scanning the irrefutable evidence. He knew, with the terrifying clarity of a seasoned lawyer, that he was looking at the end of his career if he did not immediately sever himself from the burning wreckage of his client. "Your Honor," Pendleton stammered, his booming voice reduced to a dry rasp. I assure the court, I had absolutely no knowledge of these accounts. My firm was operating entirely on the financial disclosures provided directly by Mr. Sterling. If these documents are authentic, my client has committed a gross deception against his own legal counsel. Do not attempt to jump off the ship you helped steer, counselor." Judge Rosenthal snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "You will be subjected to a full ethical review by the state bar. But your client's problems have escalated far beyond family court." The judge turned his piercing gaze to Richard. Richard's face was a horrifying portrait of a man watching his own execution. The smug, untouchable CEO who had strolled into the courtroom 20 minutes earlier was gone. He was sweating profusely, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He tugged frantically at his silk tie, suddenly finding the collar of his custom Beatty shirt unbearably tight. "This is a mistake," Richard rasped, his eyes darting wildly around the room, desperately seeking an exit that did not exist. He looked at Clara, who sat perfectly still, a statue carved from glacial ice. "Clara, what have you done? You fabricated this. You hacked my computer. This is illegal." "Address the court, Mr. Sterling," Judge Rosenthal roared, striking his gavel with such force the sound echoed like a gunshot. "You will not speak to the plaintiff. You are sitting in my courtroom, having committed documented perjury. You have committed felony wire fraud. You have attempted to use the judicial system of this state to bankrupt and humiliate your wife while hoarding millions in stolen marital assets." "Your Honor," Sarah Jenkins interjected smoothly, never breaking her professional poise. "If I may, there is one final piece of discovery regarding Mr. Sterling's employment and his heavily touted corporate assets." Judge Rosenthal nodded slowly. "Proceed, Miss Jenkins. Unveil the rest of it." Sarah opened the final folder in her slim briefcase. "Mr. Sterling has repeatedly stated on the record that his lifestyle is funded entirely by his position as CEO of Vanguard Logistics, and that he is insulated from financial ruin by corporate protections. However, Vanguard Logistics is heavily leveraged. Their primary debt holder is a European financial consortium chaired by the Kensington Sinclair Trust." Richard's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. He finally understood the true depth of the trap. He hadn't just insulted Clara's family, he had been living on their money his entire career. "Yesterday evening," Sarah continued, her voice echoing methodically, "upon learning of the severe financial fraud committed by their CEO, the board of directors at Vanguard Logistics convened an emergency session. In accordance with the moral turpitude and fraud clauses in his contract, Richard Sterling was terminated for cause, effective immediately. He receives no severance. Furthermore, to satisfy his breach of fiduciary duty, all of his vested stock options have been legally clawed back." Sarah slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Pendleton. It was the formal termination notice, signed by the chairman of Vanguard's board. "He does not have a job. He does not have a company car. The estate in Connecticut, which he transferred to a corporate LLC to hide it from my client, is currently being seized by the bank to cover his immediate corporate debts," Sarah concluded, taking her seat. "Mr. Sterling is not playing a pauper anymore, Your Honor. He truly is one." In the gallery, the loud snap of chewing gum ceased. Chloe Bennett, who had been watching the proceedings with mounting, wide-eyed panic, suddenly stood up. The illusion of the glamorous, wealthy life she had traded her youth for was disintegrating before her eyes. She looked at Richard sweating, ruined, and facing federal prison, and made a split-second, ruthless calculation. Without a single word, Chloe grabbed her Birkin bag, turned on her Alexander McQueen heels, and walked briskly out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind her, echoing with finality. She was gone. Richard was completely alone. He slumped forward, gripping the edge of the defendant's table, his knuckles white. The reality of his absolute, total destruction crashed over him. He had nothing. His money was frozen in a vault owned by his wife's father. His company had fired him. His mistress had abandoned him. And the judge was currently drafting a referral to the district attorney. "Clara," Richard whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. He ignored the judge, turning entirely toward the woman he had discarded like trash. "Clara, please. 10 years. We were married for 10 years. You can't do this to me. You can't let them send me to prison. Please, just call your father. Stop this. I'll give you whatever you want." For the first time since the trial began, Clara moved. She stood up slowly, smoothing the jacket of her midnight blue Dior suit. She looked down at the broken, trembling man who had tried to destroy her soul just weeks prior. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no vindictive joy. There was only the cold, detached pity one might reserve for an insect. "You already gave me what I wanted, Richard," Clara said, her voice soft, yet it carried the devastating, undeniable authority of the Sinclair bloodline. "You wanted a divorce. I am simply finalizing the terms." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't wait for the judge to officially declare the marriage over. Clara turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. She pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the crisp, cold air of the Connecticut morning. Waiting at the curb was the obsidian black Maybach Pullman. Thomas Croft stood by the open rear door, holding a silver-handled umbrella to shield her from a light drizzle. "Is it concluded, Miss Sinclair?" Croft asked quietly as she approached. "Yes, Thomas," Clara replied, sliding into the plush, warm leather interior of the vehicle. "It is finished. Let's go home." The heavy door closed with the sound of a vault sealing shut. As the Maybach pulled away, gliding silently into the morning traffic, the police cruisers were already pulling up to the courthouse steps to take Richard Sterling into federal custody. Clara didn't look back. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water from the car's console, opened her titanium laptop, and began reviewing the morning markets. The illusion of the helpless wife was dead and buried. The heiress had returned, and the world would never forget her name again. Sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones holding the absolute power. Richard Sterling's fatal flaw wasn't just his greed. It was his towering arrogance. He mistook Clara's kindness for weakness, her humility for powerlessness, and her silence for defeat. He believed that because he could scream the loudest and buy the most expensive suits, he owned the world. But as he learned in the most devastating way possible, true power doesn't need to scream. True power sits quietly in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to close the trap. Clara didn't just survive her humiliation. She orchestrated a masterclass in absolute, systemic retribution, proving that betraying a good heart is dangerous, but betraying a hidden empire is fatal. If you love this story of cold, calculated revenge and ultimate justice, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, dramatic stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes? See you in the next one.